Yes. Oots. All right. So once again, to introduce myself, I am Evan Perlman. I am a writer and community collaborator on the Miskatonic repository. I also have some things in the queue at Chaosium, which God willing will see the light of day sometime this decade. And more importantly and more interesting than myself are wonderful panelists here. I will introduce or actually ask Ashley Warren of the Storytelling Collective to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the Stoco as well.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Ashley Warren. I'm a narrative designer and I'm the director of the Storytelling Collective. We are an online learning program for independent creative storytellers. And we are the keepers of the RPG Writer Workshop. And we've partnered for a long time with Chaosium to offer some learning material about writing your first Call of Cthulhu adventure. And we also have a Rune Quest path if that's of interest to anyone here. There might be some overlap there. And yeah, we're really excited to have a continuing partnership with Chaosium. We love connecting with people who are really passionate about writing for Call of Cthulhu. It's such a great game. And yeah, just this topic today is our bread and butter at Storytelling Collective. So I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And I am now hungry for bread and butter, but I will wait
Yes.
until after. Rina Haenze is a best-selling author on the Miskatonic repository and an Emmy award-winning podcaster. They can be found on the Old Ways podcast, where they are head of Mythos, which is a title that we should all aspire to, and on Ain't Slayed Nobody. Rina, anything else you want to say about yourself?
Just that you can find my scenarios on Drive-Thru RPG. I have 9 scenarios, including the gold bestseller Saturday the 14th, which is a slasher flick homage. And yeah, you can find me in a bunch of places. I pop up on How We Roll, Symphony Entertainment, and a bunch of other podcasts, so I get around. I'm very excited to be here.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Thank you for joining us. Heinrich Moore is another best-selling writer. We're collecting them now on Chaosium's Miskatonic repository and the chair for the Council of Shoggoths, which is the organizing committee for this con that you are at right now. Heinrich also oversees efforts by the council to grow and support the community of Call of Cthulhu content creators on the Miskatonic repository, including through his YouTube channel, Heinrich Moore Presents. Heinrich, anything else you would like to say?
No, just excited to be here. This is our 5th annual MRCon. So I'm just really grateful for everyone who made time to join and hope everyone's having a great time.
Great, thank you. And Leslie Horn, also known as XPLovecat, is a YouTuber. Is that fair to call you a YouTuber?
Yeah, I think I'm legit enough for that.
An editor, reviewer, a member of the Shoggoths as well, and we'll fill you in on additional things now.
Yeah, so I love working with clients on Call of Cthulhu scenarios, and people come to me at a lot of different stages. So I'm quite familiar with the writing process, and I'm happy to be here to chat about that.
Woo! Excellent. So for our viewers, what I will ask is in the initial stages, as the panel discusses questions and topics amongst themselves, just hold questions, but you can put things in the chat. And if you have something in the chat that you want us to discuss as we go, we'll try to pick that up. If there is time remaining at the end, we'll then solicit another round of questions. And as a reminder, please keep video off and please keep muted if you're not on the panel, because otherwise we descend into chaos and all is vanity. With that said, we can get started. One thing that I would like to know from everyone, if you could talk about some of your projects where you felt the workflow was really important. I think, as we're starting to talk about workflow, I think it would help to get a sense of how it affects your thing. So these could be particularly large projects or complicated ones or ones with a time constraint, anywhere where you feel that your particular workflow mattered to the final result. And we will start with Heinrich.
Sure. Well, I think in terms of projects where workflow was very important, the last one I worked on, the Carcosa Guide, was certainly an example because I didn't know what it was going to be when I started working on it. And I think that's not that unusual for folks who begin working on a scenario and maybe don't know exactly where it's going to end. But it meant that there was a lot of progress that was then undone as I course corrected. And so I think having a workflow that was able to be adaptive to that was really important. So what that meant in practice was that I set aside regular amounts of time to work on a project, but I also modified how I worked on the project, when, where, depending on what stage of the project I was at. So the brainstorming stage required a certain kind of workflow, the outlining required a different kind of workflow, and then the actual writing of it, never mind the later, testing and editing, required yet a different one. And I found really that different workflows for different phases of the project became very important. So happy to expand on that later as we go on.
Yes. Yeah, we will definitely dive into those phases and the specific tools and workflows. We'll go to Leslie, sort of going in reverse order of my Zoom boxes here.
Yeah, so a recent project, I was working with John Crowdis on his fragments scenario. So it's a serialized campaign. And that was a little bit different because we had to sit down and figure out, okay, when are you going to tackle the connections to the first scenario? How does that play throughout the second scenario? And then when do you tackle things like the final ritual? Like, when do you have to have those things nailed down so that there's other connections earlier in the scenario? So that was just a little bit more complicated, and it was important to have some organization prior to like really getting into everything so that there was that connection to the first scenario.
Yeah, thank you. That is organization is a huge thing that we'll talk about, especially with longer form pieces. So we'll come back to that in a moment. Rina.
So my very first scenario, Saturday the 14th, was written with the Storytelling Collective in a month.
Hey.
Back when it was write your scenario in a month. And so workflow was incredibly important on that one because I had such a short time to do it in, and I was determined to get it done in that month, come hell or high water. So I had to have everything organized and laid out and had to know exactly where I was going when I was doing the actual writing part. I play test first before I write, so that gave me a different style of creating my workflow. And then Friends of Dorothy, my most recent scenario, is a completely different type of workflow because I took almost a year to write it. And so just the stages that I went through were completely different. How I approached my outlining was completely different. And so I've had a couple of different approaches to my workflow based on the scenario that I'm writing.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and we'll explore, which ones are most appropriate for what kind of thing. And Ashley.
Yeah, I've done I always seem to find myself committed to like big projects. So in order to like, and like Rina, like I will get to the finish line, like come hell or high water, like you said. I'm very much a completionist. So it's really important for me to have a good workflow. I've been working on a project this year. It's not Call of Cthulhu, but it is a tabletop game. It's an original game that is funded by a grant. And because it's grant funded, there's a lot of milestones there, and you need to provide a lot of documentation on your progress. So it's an original system, original collection of stories, and it's very research intensive. So from the get-go, I've had to be very structured about it, and there's a lot of stakeholders and artists and people involved. So I have to keep my own writing organized, and I have to keep their project organized. So it's been like basically like spreadsheet mayhem. So yeah, workflows I feel like they just like drive everything that I do. And like everyone else said, that they do kind of evolve and change based on the kind of project you're doing. But yeah, I feel like having those systems in place from the get-go, I think is just really, for me, it's really important for my creativity. When I can not necessarily think about the logistics, I can be more like kind of creative, and I feel like I do my better writing when I'm not thinking about all the other stuff at the same time. So that's kind of how I kick off all of my projects, is thinking through all those fun things. I think it's fun. Not everyone thinks the organization stuff is fun, but I think it can be fun if you embrace it.
Yeah, I mean, look, as someone who half the time, like the way I play RPGs is by creating a character and then stopping. I get it. The beginning is the most fun a lot. So let's talk about the beginning. And Ashley, I'll come back to you. What are the planning stages of the projects like, and what does that look like in your workflow? And As we go through and talk about the different phases, beginning with planning, also are there any tools that you use from spreadsheets to Scrivener to whatever it might be?
Sure. So folks who are familiar with our program at the Storytelling Collective will recognize when I say scope setting. And basically what I do and what we kind of like guide our students to do is to set a project scope. And what that means is like, what's the deliverable? Like, what are you actually working toward? What's the timeline by which you want to have this done? How can you break that into some smaller components to set some milestones within that? We try to think about it like as milestones versus deadlines, because sometimes those shift, but it really depends on, again, the deliverable and who you're working with. Sometimes those deadlines are really, really important, and then sometimes there's some flexibility there. And then thinking through any potential obstacles you might encounter. And an obstacle isn't necessarily like a negative thing. It's just like something that may affect the progress of this particular project. Like if you're going on vacation, or your kids are out of school for a week, or things like that that may come up during this project timeline. I think it's really important to try to factor those in, even though we never know how life is going to be. But I find that just like planning ahead for obstacles makes them a little less jarring when they do inevitably come up. So I always try to kind of plan out the scope of my project. I try to be really realistic about it, but I'm not always very good at doing that. I tend to be ambitious and then have to kind of like adjust halfway through. So I always have to start there. I just have to really like actually write all of that down and really think through it so that I can hold myself accountable throughout the project. And then in terms of tools, I use something called Notion, which I find to just be really flexible for project planning. There's all sorts of great tools out there. That's just the one that I particularly like. And then I do make use of Google Docs a lot and Google Sheets, because when I'm working with collaborators, not everyone else uses Notion. And I know it's really frustrating to have to learn someone else's system when you're coming on board for a project. So I tend to kind of find myself in Google Sheets a lot. And actually, they have a lot of really cool tools now for project management these days. Just like really, they have cool templates and drag and drop like interactive cells and things like that. So it's pretty cool. So that's kind of like my starting point, is I just have to really just like map out the entirety of the project.
That is really cool and helpful. I think I found their website. There was another one called Motion that apparently does almost the same thing, and I almost grabbed that one. So if this is correct, then
That is
go
correct.
check this out. Okay, great.
Yeah.
One thing I want to follow up on, you mentioned defining the scope at the beginning of the project, and what does that mean, particularly for a creative project? What does scope look like?
Yeah, so I have a free guide at storytellingcollective.com if you'd like to actually like work through this the way that we have factored into all of our courses. And I'm really not saying that to like upsell you, like it is free, but it's a guide. So it'll take you through the process of here's all the things you need to think about when planning your scope. So it kind of it includes some of those components that I talked about, like your timeline, your deadline. Like, is this, a month-long project? Is it longer than this? What are the milestones that come up within that? What is the final deliverable? There's one question that I think is really important. That's like, are you going to have to learn anything new as part of this project? Like, are you learning layout for the first time? Are you learning art direction? Are you learning how to write a tabletop game? Because we usually don't factor in the learning time into a project, especially a first project. And that can kind of derail a project if you're not already factoring that into your scope. And then and then thinking through all of those other pieces, like, layout and editing and play testing is super important to all, to the timeline, because that can be kind of time consuming. I love that Rina said that they do that at the beginning of a project. That's so cool. And I want to hear more about that. So it's basically just like, yeah, thinking through all of those steps, all the things that will need to be done in order to complete this project. And even then, like what happens after that? Like, what's your marketing plan? Like, how are you going to reflect on this project and make changes to your process for next time? So that's really what your scope is. You're kind of front loading a lot of the really like critical thinking heavy parts of your project at this stage, so that when you get into the creative parts, I mean, this is creative, but when you get into like the writing parts, you're prepared to basically dive in. And I find it's really helpful for accountability and to keep you on track. Scope creep is very real to everyone in tabletop. It's so easy for a project to kind of bloom, and sometimes that means you don't finish it if you don't have a good scope setting process. So that's something that we just really urge people to get into the habit of doing. And also that will change, the way you plan your scope will change as you do more projects. So it's not something that's set in stone.
Let me see, Rina, any thoughts on the planning stage particularly? Or the organizing stage?
I don't do a whole lot of planning, if I'm completely honest.
Please be honest.
Yeah, so planning is not my strong suit, but organization is very important. Um, I have a conspiracy wall, the best way to call it, where things are connected with either red lines or string or whatever I have laying around, like little post-it notes showing where bits are connected, which is probably an unconventional way to do it, but that's my aesthetic. So here we are. But just making sure all of your points line up with each other and making sure that things refer back where they need to refer back. So you're not suddenly dropping a new NPC in the middle of a scenario when you haven't put that NPC in the NPC section, or making sure that your outcomes line up with how people are going to approach the ending of your scenario. So having that organization structure, whatever it is, whether you're doing it in Notion or you're just laying it out in a bullet point outline or you're doing the conspiracy wall, whatever it is, that's going to be incredibly important for having a consistent scenario at the end of things.
That's really helpful. And I haven't done it yet, but I would like to start including those in the scenarios that I publish, or some version of that where it's and I know that there are some writers who do this. I think Gumshoe does this really beautifully, where they graphically map out how everything connects so that the keeper has that at a glance. And some of it is, that you describe is backstage stuff, just making sure the references line up. But I think the motivations and the playthrough stuff, that might be a nice standard to have as we go forward in the future. So thanks for introducing that. Leslie.
So in terms of the initial deadline or milestone, as Ashley was putting it, I like to have some organization in a Microsoft To-Do app. It's pretty simple. I like to keep my life simple, so I don't have a ton of apps. But that is a good one for me because I can have a subsection for whatever project I'm working on and then break it down by the different milestones that I want to hit in ideal dates that I want to hit those. So that's just a nice way to organize it in an app if that's something that is helpful for you. And then the other thing I wanted to touch on is more about outlining. So particularly when you're looking at, is your scenario going to be a linear scenario or a sandbox scenario? Like what kind of structure do you want for your scenario? And if it leans more towards being sandbox, I feel like flowcharts can be really helpful during that stage, because then you're mapping out the clues, where you can find those clues, where those clues can move, and that will help you actually like help the keeper, because at the end of the day, that's what your writing is supposed to do, is help the keeper to run it at the table. So having that mapped out before you even go to sit down and write can be really helpful, particularly when you're working with more complexity with a sandbox type scenario. And then in general, I find outlines to be a wonderful tool for role-playing games, because you kind of have to have all the pieces, unlike sitting down to write a novel where you might be able to just kind of figure it out as you go. And with a role-playing game, I feel like you kind of need more than that before you actually sit down.
If I can counterpoint, just
Go for it.
The way I do scenarios, and I know a couple other people I've talked to who do this the same way or similar, is just I call it the 3 bullet points on a napkin, because that was what I did with Saturday the 14th, where I just had 3 things that popped into my head, and then I played the scenario without having written anything. And then the outline came after, when I'd play tested it 3 or 4 times and got an idea of where things were going and how people were going to react to the scenario. And then that worked out with the outline and then the scenario. But I had the whole scenario planned out, or not planned out, but played out in my head and with my players before we got to the outline. Because I think for some people, outlining at the start doesn't necessarily help, because you get kind of lost, or you might not know where people are going to go with it. So I think for a lot of people, outlining is the best way to go, but like that never works for me. I usually have to go with playing it first and then writing an outline based on how the play test went.
Just
Just a thought.
I greatly respect and am terrified by that approach. But there are going to be people that works for, and there are going to be people that works for best, which is really exciting. And I'm glad that we have this representation of different approaches, because you can see that these all work. These all lead to successful scenarios. And Heinrich.
Yeah, I'll put my cards on the table that I'm probably the exact opposite of Rina when it comes to writing, in that my playtesting comes last, and by the time I playtest, you know, I've had some terrible playtests, and those have resulted in things changing. But broadly speaking, the scenario is figured out and done by the time I get to playtesting. I may have written a terrible scenario at that point, but that is for better or worse how I've proceeded. In terms of the planning stages, I want to touch on the fact that for most of the folks here, when we're working on the project, we're doing so in a, I'll call, hobby capacity, right? As an enthusiast who is not doing this ultimately because it's going to be their paycheck, but because it's something they're passionate about and they want to conjure into the world. And so some of the types of things that I use in my day-to-day job, for example, are a level of rigorousness in terms of planning and scheduling that may not be appropriate or workable for you as an individual if you're working on something that you consider foremost to be a hobby project. So I think there's an element of knowing when to allow yourself to take time. And the conceptual planning stage is exactly that time. You know, folks often come up to me and sort of describe a scenario and what they've done on it, and I'll start asking uncomfortable questions like, "Oh, great, when is it getting published?" Like, or by when are you going to have this step done? Because they have already moved past the conceptual stage. They are now in the writing stage. They are in the put your shoulder into it stage, where you really need to focus on typing words on a page. But that's not the planning stage. And so one of the things that I do that sounds similar, I think, to what Rina described is I use an idea bank. So I will have a thesis statement that's broadly the scope. So I know whether I'm trying to design a scenario, whether I'm writing a book. I know that I want the scenario to either be 1 or 2 hours, 3 or 4, 7 to 8, right? So I know whether it's a short, long, medium, whatever scenario. But then my idea bank is really just all the random concepts that I've had in connection with this project. And that could be everything from a location to a character to a scene to emotions to smells. It all goes in there, right? It all just gets slapped in there. And then from there, I start outlining and coming up with scenes and seeing where different parts of this idea bank can plug in. And as Ashley was noting, I usually work in Google Docs. I used to work in Word. I've tried a few different things, and I've just found Google Docs has a level of simplicity to it. That means wherever I am, if I have an idea, I can open up my phone, I can access Google Docs, I can edit it there, I can have my laptop at a coffee shop and work there. It just provides me that flexibility, because especially at the conceptual stage, I don't know necessarily when I am going to make progress.
Yeah, that's and we got a little bit into the next piece, which is actually drafting it. So we'll come back to that in just a moment. I want to highlight something Heinrich said, which is to have an idea of how long you want the scenario to be. And I think this is included in the Storytelling Collective Scope tool. But it is really important to know how long you want your piece to be. You know, and if you're writing a short scenario, convention length, a multi-session scenario, or a campaign, right? And once you're happy with that, try to stick with it. It can be, you know, we've seen people checking in some of the writers groups that say, oh, you know, I was starting this campaign and it feels like it's becoming I was starting this scenario and it feels like it's becoming a campaign, and then we never hear from them again. And that's sad, because they probably could have finished had they kept to their scope. I'm not calling out anyone particularly. I do not have a name in mind. Don't ask me. But it has happened, and I don't want that to happen to you. So consider that and plan accordingly. Let's keep it moving. Let's talk about your drafting tools as well. Could you, as you address this, could you talk about, you know, what kind of structure are you using? So you have a particular time and place every day? Do you kind of snatch time as you can? Are you using Google Docs in the car on your phone like I do? You know, what works for you and what might work for others. We'll uncover that as we go. Leslie, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll start with the structure question. So I have learned by being more attentive to my energy levels, what time of day I am most productive, and I'm going to be best at my creative work. For me, it's 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. It will be different for everyone, but I know that that's like, if I really have a big project that's going to need my focus and attention, that is the time of day in which I want to sit down and do that. In terms of location, I really can work anywhere, and I like to work different places because I feel like it helps me keep my brain active. Of seeing different settings can just keep me fresh and keep the energy up, especially when you get like in the middle of a project and you're in the lull stage. So you don't have the early excitement and you don't have the end of the tunnel light coming. You're just like right in the muddy middle. It can be really helpful to go somewhere else. I particularly have really awesome libraries that I like to rent out a room and just sit and type. So that's my structure in terms of drafting and some tools there. Google Docs, like everyone has said, is really great for collaborations as well if you're working with anyone else. And then for focusing, I really like to use the timer method. So like on Windows, there's under clock, there's like something called focus sessions, and you can click, I want to work for 40 minutes and say start, and then it'll automatically put a break in for you as well, like a 5-minute break. That's helpful to have like the little timer in the upper right-hand corner. That might stress some people out, but for me, it's like, okay, I just need to focus for 20 minutes. That's it. I don't have to work for 2 hours, just this 20 minutes. And that can really be helpful for chunking it when you're trying to get through the drafting phase.
Thank you. Yeah, and I want to just hype timers of any kind are wonderful. You can look up the Pomodoro method. It wasn't created for this, but I think we've all used it at times, and for various reasons, whether life is hard or your brain is hard, it is really useful. It gives you permission to just go for that short amount of time without thinking about what comes next, and then you have to stop, and then you're like, man, I want to keep going. So you can, but after your break. But at least you've done that piece. Let me go to Heinrich then.
So during the conceptual stage, right, I'm probably doing a lot of hiking, walking dogs, sitting outside, staring into nothingness, right, with a notebook and occasionally jotting down ideas. Once we do get to the drafting stage, that is when a structure gets imposed. And for me, it's similar to Leslie. I don't quite have the staying power. So for me, it's probably more like 10 a.m. to noon, sometimes more like 9 to 11. And for me, if I can do that on the weekend, right? If I can do that Saturday morning, if I can do that Sunday morning, that's 4 hours of drafting. It's not necessarily great, but it keeps me making steady progress. And I do find that, especially in sort of the more telework forward environment, I need to get out of the house and get myself away from the distractions. I need a coffee shop. I need a library. I need a restaurant, right? Anything that has Wi-Fi, I can sit there. But I need to put myself in an element where my mind and body know, okay, you are doing something different. You are not around your house. You are committed for this period of time. And in terms of tools, we've talked about Google Docs. One of the things I like about Google Docs is it's very easy to make a copy of your draft, call it a new draft X, whatever, and then work on it. And the reason I really like the idea of multiple drafts is I hate deleting things. I hate destroying. I like progress. I want my ideas to develop. Unfortunately, in the writing process, that's not always possible. Sometimes we do need to expand or expel ideas. And if I just have a single draft, even if I know I can kind of go back to a version history, that doesn't give me the same comfort as going, all right, we're going to call this the rough draft. And now I'm going to save it. I'm going to make a copy. And this is then going to be called draft 1. And draft 1, I can delete whatever I want because I know it's safe in my rough draft and I can get it back if I need to. But I find that sort of a safety blanket to allow myself to be more creative, because sometimes we do need to remove those ideas, leave them for another project in order to make progress on this one. Oh, and I'll shout out for the gamers among us, if you are on Steam or other digital platforms, there is a game called Spirit City Lo-Fi Session, which is just like an adorable way of keeping yourself structured. It has timers, it has calendars, it has just chill music. And for some folks who maybe don't have the option of going out to a coffee shop or whatever, turning on a program like that may have the same effect for you as for some of us leaving the house.
That's lovely. Thank you. I'll have to check that out. Yeah, no, that's great. Rina?
So when it comes to the ideas phase, which for me is my quick bullet points, I like to sit on the beach with a notebook. Sometimes it'll just randomly come to me and I'll literally scribble things on a napkin in a restaurant or at a coffee shop if I don't have anything else to write on. But my favorite bit is sitting on the beach on my favorite rock. I have a favorite rock, with a notebook and just scribbling things down. So being somewhere calming, like, with natural sound, natural light, all of those is very refreshing for me, and it helps me get the creative juices flowing. When it comes to the drafting stage, so I have ADHD, so I'm always in one of two modes. I either can't focus, in which case using the Pomodoro method is super helpful because then I just put it on for 25 minutes and then I get a 5-minute break and so on, and brain doesn't get as distracted by things. Or I'm in hyper focus mode, where I sit down for long hours and don't even notice that I haven't stood up or drunk water or anything. I wrote Saturday the 14th in a 17-hour stretch, where I had no idea how much time was passing. I just sat down to write and I looked up 17 hours later and went, oops. So for me, drafting goes one of two directions. I personally like the hyper focus mode best for me, because I get a lot done and my schedule is kind of all over the place with work and everything. So the hyper focus lets me get a lot done in a very short period of time. So maybe I can take the next day off because I'm working until 9 p.m. or whatever it is. But I use Google Docs as well. I like what Heinrich was talking about, the making copies. So got draft 57 set up somewhere of a particular scenario or whatever. I also use my conspiracy wall at that point. I start moving the post-it notes around based on how I'm revising in my drafting. And I also like to make a map in PowerPoint because I haven't used any of the fancy tools yet, but now I'm going to have to look into Notion. Like putting boxes and squares and circles around and highlighting things differently using different fonts. Different fonts are great for drafting. I will say this because your mind tends to kind of scan through things when you have Times New Roman because you're just so used to reading it. Different fonts, especially highlighting key areas you might need to go back to, or areas that need more work, are really useful for sticking in your brain. They'll just stick there and you go, oh, yep, I wrote that in Comic Sans. That's an important one. I need to go back to that, or Papyrus, or whatever it is that helps it stick in your brain. I find changing the fonts, changing the colors, all of that super, super helpful in helping me draft.
I'll jump off on one of the things Rina said, which was using different fonts is a great idea. Using highlights is an awesome idea. I do the question mark method, which is I'm writing and I'm like, and then they go into a warehouse and bad stuff happens, question mark, and then I just move on. And at some point later on, I do a search for where do I have 3 question marks in a row, and that quickly tells me all the areas I still need to expand on.
I have one more fun fact to share based on that. So in the publishing world, we use TK because no English word in the language uses TK in that word. So that's also a way you can do it, and then Control F to find your 3 question marks or your TK, either one.
Yeah, and I do the same thing with a couple of @ symbols, although now it thinks I'm trying to like summon someone. So our documents are too online. but it's if you use 2 or 3, that works. It's really helpful. And Ashley.
Yeah, I feel like my process is very similar to what everyone kind of shared here. I like live and breathe the Pomodoro method. I just find that it really kind of keeps me on track for things. It's really easy for me to fall into multitasking like habits when I'm writing. And I find that I don't necessarily like to have like a whole day just to write. I do a lot better if I have just like a sprint basically. So I love to write kind of in shorter stints, and that's largely because I do so much like outline and thinking that by the time I'm ready to actually write, like my brain kind of is like has already been percolating on what I'm going to be putting on the page. That can kind of change from project to project, but that's usually how I like to do that. A lot of people in our community love this Spirit City Lo-Fi, so thanks for sharing that recommendation. I love the on YouTube. There's a bunch of Pomodoro method like ambient videos. I love the Skyrim ones, and they have 50-minute ones and 25-minute ones, and I just find they're just like really atmospheric and immersive, and they just kind of get me in the writing mindset, even if I'm not writing fantasy. And I love the suggestions for changing font. I tend to do that when I'm in what Leslie called like the muddy middle or the messy middle of a project. Sometimes just like changing the way my document looks helps kind of like get me back into the swing of working on a project. I always get to a point with every project, no matter how organized I am, where I just feel like kind of stuck. I just like, I know that that's going to happen and I kind of prepare for it. And usually like changing up the appearance of my document usually helps a lot. And Google Docs has a lot of cool features for doing that. Even though the written word is my medium of choice, I'm a very visual person. So I like when things can look really, I don't know, aesthetically pleasing, and that just kind of like unlocks my brain a little bit and helps me get past that. Yeah, I feel like those are kind of the main ones. Everything that everyone else said was like, yeah, I do that too. I do that too. Timers are really good, and sometimes I'll even try to bring in other sensory details. Like sometimes I'll have like a candle that's linked to a specific project, so that when I light the candle, it's like my brain's like, okay, you need to like start thinking about this specific project, and music. And I make a lot of mood boards as part of my creative process. It's something that we encourage people to try doing when they're writing their first project, just as another tool in their toolkit. And I like to revisit that, sometimes use it as a prompt. And I just find that having all of these different like sensory inputs like kind of makes my brain focus on things. And yeah, so I would say like in terms of time of day or whatever, like Leslie, it took me a while to kind of figure out what works best for me. Even though I have kind of the privilege of writing and having that be kind of a big part of my livelihood, I still have a lot of other stuff to do, so it's not always easy for me to set like a specific day or time. But I've been working on setting like one morning a week aside for writing. I usually don't have a specific day. It just kind of depends on my schedule. But I find that like usually like 9 a.m. to noon is like a good window for me to do creative work. I used to spend all that time doing my admin and like emails and stuff. And I was like, why am I using the best brain power time on the stuff that doesn't need it? So I try to flip my day around like that. It took me forever to figure that out for myself. So maybe if you feel like you do the same thing, maybe try doing that. And then I'm still kind of like a night owl. So I have a child who does not like to sleep. So I don't always get the luxury of like staying up late to write, but sometimes like the late night 11 p.m. writing session just like still appeals to me. It's a luxury at this point. So yeah, I would say just like there's a lot of experimentation that happens here. It's pretty fun to figure out what works best for you, but these are all like really good tools to have in your toolkit, especially if you get to that stage in the process where you're feeling stuck. Like try making a mood board, try and finding an ambient video, try a 20-minute sprint. If you feel daunted by like writing a big section, like just you don't have to do a huge section, just do a short section. Like just have all these different tactics and something will inevitably work for you, but it's fun to figure that out.
Yeah, that's great. And we'll come back towards the end towards how people can kind of, who haven't been mindfully using a particular tool, can figure out what works for them. But before we get to that, I want to get to the later stages, the middle stages of writing, right? So you've got your draft, and now you're into editing, you're into tinkering, you're maybe in danger of falling into perpetually tinkering and just never being satisfied. So tell me a little bit about how you handle editing, how you handle progressing towards the end, and then how you know that you're done. And let's start with Ashley there, I think.
I love this question because so many of our writers, they get to this stage and it's like they just they get into these perfectionist tendencies. And so one thing that I've been doing, because I'm also a kind of perfectionist by nature, is to basically set like a rubric for myself for what do I consider to be like the best quality that I can do for this particular project. And that kind of like keeps me in check for what I'm able to do to produce my best work. Because like the project I'm working on now, like there's editors, there's an art budget, like there's things that are beyond my own capacity to do. So I have a little bit, more there. But when I'm working on a project independently, I don't necessarily have a massive art budget or a huge layout budget. And so I have to be really mindful about like the quality that I aspire for. I think a lot of people in our community, we look at the Call of Cthulhu books, the official ones, and we're like, I want to do that. But we are one person and there's a team there producing all of that. Not that you can't do amazing work on your own, but you don't necessarily need to hold yourself to the exact same standards as a company that has like a whole team. So I say that because I know that can be a deterrent for people actually publishing. So I would just say like, consider like what you consider to be your best quality work. If that means you might not be able to hire an editor, even though I think you always should, but I understand that that's not always feasible. What are some self-editing tricks that you can do? Taking a break from your project, reading it aloud, having a friend look over it. Like what's in your like ability to do, and do that the best that you can. And also, work that is published is better for you than work that is not published. Like, this is not your only project that you need to do in your life. It's not all of your creative success is going to hinge on this one project. So it's better for you to put something out there, get feedback on it, learn how it could be better, and then apply that all to your next project. Or you can go back and update your projects now. Like if you publish on the Miskatonic repository, like you can go back and update your projects. I've done that with some of my old projects. So nothing ever has to be like permanent. But I think sitting on a project for too long and aspiring for perfectionism is just like, you're going to kind of like kill your own creativity and your momentum that way. And then just use the tools that are at your disposal, like connect with people in the community where you can swap, your work with them and things like that. Those are all things that I do. And I've done enough projects by now because I'm a completionist, like, so I kind of know when something's done. And again, I always go back to my rubric, like, is this kind of checking the boxes for what I think is feasible? Am I within my own budget? Did I do the best that I feel like I could do? Is this something that I just want to get out there? Is it serving like a purpose? So those are all things that kind of keep me in check for that. And yeah, I think we conflate perfectionism with wanting to produce good work. And it's good to aspire for that. If perfectionism is that's a fruitless effort. Nothing's going to be perfect. You could do everything and someone still might not like your work. It's okay. Like you've done the best you can. So aspire for quality and whatever that means to you, and let go of the perfectionist tendency. So, and also if you're not sure, then like share it with the community. Like if you're like, I don't know if this is good enough to post, is there any kind of like glaring holes that I missed? That this community is amazing at helping one another. So you do have a lot of people here that will give you that feedback for free, basically, which I think is just like an amazing and valuable resource. So those are the things that I do, and usually what we kind of like advise to our community.
Great. And Leslie, I know this is a big area of expertise for you as well.
Yeah, so I'm going to go through a real quick overview of what I think you should do when you have your first draft done. And that is, number one, splurge all of the thoughts out on a piece of paper that you think you need to fix. Just get it out of your brain on a piece of paper. I do recommend taking a break, whether that means a couple of days for you or a couple of weeks, a couple months, whatever that means for you. I think a break is helpful to disconnect yourself from being in the grind work and like really in the project. Then when you come back, reread your draft. As you read through it, I recommend making comments. You can do this in pretty much every Word document, kind of Google Doc thing that you're using. And you can just highlight whatever text you want, make a comment, and make a note to yourself of what you think needs improved about that specific section. If there's maybe something doesn't make sense later, you forgot to mention it above, this is your time to kind of reread this with fresh eyes and make comments about what you think needs fixed. And then after you have that, if you are a more structured person, you can kind of make a plan for revision, which would be organizing all of those comments and saying prioritizing them in terms of the really big developmental structural edits down to the more little line edits, which I'm referring to, like description, or I need to make sure to bold all of my roles, like those things that can come later in the process after we actually have like the scenario all planned out the way that you would like it to. So this plan for revision is really making sure that you're tackling anything that's going to make the most amount of cascade effects in your scenario, which means I change this thing, and that means 5 other things have to change because I changed this one thing. Those are the things you should edit first, so that you're not doing double, triple, a million different drafts. So really thinking about how that's going to look like for you once you've read through your draft and making those comments, ordering them in priority of the biggest ones down to the small detailed stuff that could come later in the process. And then this process might happen a few times with you. It just kind of depends on how you write in the beginning. Some people like to really take their time with the first draft. Some people just like to get it on the page as fast as they can. So that'll be very dependent on a lot of different people. But I would say that the 2 questions that you should ask yourself to say, is this project done? Once you're on that edge of, is it done? Is it not done? The first question is, can a stranger run this game by reading this document? If you think to the best of your knowledge that the answer is yes, okay, let's go to question number 2. Is this fun? Which I think is more important than pretty much anything else, because as keepers, we kind of run with anything. So I think if you check those 2 boxes, and if you put in a lot of effort and you feel good about the product that you are putting together, then you're good to go, and you should hit that publish button.
Awesome. Yes, excellent. Heinrich, who has done a video specifically about how to know when you're done. What are your
Sure.
thoughts?
I'll start with that, but then talk about some other
Oh,
tools.
and sorry, just as we're entering the last 10 minutes of the discussion, chat, if you've got questions, audience, please put them in the chat and we will try to get to them as we continue on. Sorry, Heinrich. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Oh, 10 minutes. Okay, let's go fast then. So one thing I have, I think I learned it from one of Hank Green's YouTube videos, and that is what you're aiming for is not to be 100% happy with your project. What you're really looking for is about 80% satisfaction. Get it to the point where it is 80% as good as you could possibly get it. There's many reasons for sort of choosing 80%, but the fact is that it's that last 20%, that last 10% where matters of style and taste begin to take on such an oversized role that you frankly can't tell whether you are at 95% of your capability or 90% or what have you. And it is, as Ashley indicated, much better to have a project that's out there that is 80% as good as you could have done it, possibly, as opposed to something that's sitting at 85, 90, 95%, because it doesn't matter, right? If it doesn't get published, it was a nice personal project, but if your ambition is to get it out into the world, then that needs to be the objective. So how can we get to that 80%? Well, for me, as much as I emphasize taking time at the beginning of the process in the conceptual stage, where take all the time you in the world to brainstorm and think about it, to get comfortable with this project. Once you get to the drafting stage, for me, I need to have a regular schedule of writing, 2 hours at this time. And that takes as long as it takes, right? So long as I am sticking to the schedule and writing, that is fine. That can take as long as it needs to, but it's structured. As we get to the editing stage, now we are at a point where, for me, I now am treating parts of the editing process as a matter of resources. So what Leslie was describing in terms of sort of a splurge of ideas and getting everything down that needs to get fixed. For me, I call that my substantive edit. It's when I have my draft, I print it out, and I take my red pen and I sit and I edit by hand and write notes in the margins. And then later I'll go with a black pen and I'll strike out edits as I incorporate them into the draft. But you know how many substantive edits I get? I get one. I get a substantive edit. It takes a long time, and it takes even longer to incorporate all of that. Once that's done, I get a playtest. I don't get to keep playtesting. I get a playtest. And if the playtest is awful, well, I better incorporate that feedback. But that was my playtest. I'm taking advantage of other people's time and generosity. And I know that I can keep playtesting and make it better and better. Every playtest is probably going to make your product better. So you don't need maybe one playtest. Maybe for you it's 2 or 3, but have a number and commit to that. If otherwise you found yourself struggling, and then I get one third-party playtest. I get to send my scenario to one person and they run it. I'm not present. I just hear their feedback afterwards, and I incorporate edits based on that. And then I get a proofread edit. I get one of those, and then I get one final looks edit, where I read the thing backwards. And that's it. Anything I don't catch in that, that's a shame. But I've gotten better, and the next time my 80% is going to look like what my 95% would have looked like on my previous project.
Thank you. That was really helpful, and just reading backwards. Sorry, I distracted myself because reading backwards, I think you told me about that, Heinrich, but that was like the first time I saw that, I was like, oh, wow, that's really useful. If you have a brain like mine that skips over things that it's seen before. And so forcing yourself to come at it from the other angle is a way to catch all those stuff. Rina, I'm going to actually put a new question to you as we're coming down to the last couple of minutes, because I think your perspective would be really valuable. We had a question from the chat about how do you move from your initial concept to something with structure. And you, of all of us, I think, have the strongest jump from a napkin to an outline. And so for someone who's got a really strong hook, right, or they have a scene they can see in their head, different people start at different places. How do you go from that to something that has scenes and structure and bones?
So talking out your ideas, whether it's in a playtest or talking it out with someone else. I have a writing partner, also my artist, actually. He does most of the art for my scenarios, James Bennell. We talk through ideas. So I do my play tests, and that's how I do things. But if I get stuck on a scene or I'm not sure where to go in a bit, then I go, James, here's what I'm thinking. Here's my scene. Where do I go from here? What are some ideas that you have? And we'll talk through them. Or I'll give him an idea and say, this is what I'm doing. And do you think it makes sense? And can I move on from this scene? So that's something I find very, very useful, is having a person to talk to who is not connected to your project, writing wise, who can give you suggestions for moving on, who can talk it through with you, let you brainstorm. Because just brainstorming on your own is good, but it's not always going to help you get to the next point. It's not always going to help you get to the next idea. So having someone else who can help you get there, those fresh ideas or that fresh perspective, is one of the best things you can possibly do with going on from concept to here's a fully fleshed out idea. Or you can always just, take your 3 points and run and play test it and see what happens. You could always do that. But in case you're not feeling like doing that, then having someone else to talk to and work through your brainstorming with is probably the best thing that I can offer.
Thanks. Other thoughts on making the jump from idea to beginning structure, Leslie?
I think it can be helpful to take a look at published Chaosium scenarios for guidance on the different sections that you can include in your scenario. And I say can because you do not need to copy their structure. That is optional, but it is something that can be helpful if you're struggling with, like, I have an idea now, what do I do? If you take something that's already published that you really like, it could also be something on the Miskatonic repository, and you're like, I loved this person's structure and the format of their scenario. Write out the headings that they used and just start bullet pointing under those headings generally you're going to have your NPC, your introduction, your NPCs. Then we start talking about locations. What are the different clues? What locations do you have in your scenario? Brainstorming that, and then you'll have your conclusion, which is how is this actually going to wrap up? What are the different ways that people can solve this mystery or whatever is happening in your scenario? So that's my tip: is look at what's already been done, copy headings, and then start brainstorming from there.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know if anybody else had other one thing that I do when I'm stuck is I've called it a table read, where I don't have RP elements to it. I just have the plot, or sometimes it's just the inciting scene, and I'll sit down with Heinrich or someone and just say, all right, pretend you're the character. You walk into a room, you see this horrible murder scene. What's your next move? And then they'll tell you what to write next, because they'll say, okay, I want to investigate this clue. I want to go talk to this guy, and that gives you your next couple of scenes, and then you can spin that out. Also really helpful if you have like the background of the scenario, not a huge backstory, but the immediate inciting events that led to it, because then that's the part I get stuck on all the time, but that tells you what your clues are most likely to be. And investigative horror makes it easy to grab onto that structure, because you can just say, someone did this, what did they leave behind? And then you can follow that through until you find that someone and something bad happens. Other thoughts, Heinrich, Ashley?
I'll just jump in with a quick tip that Leslie was indicating, which is headings. So absolutely true what Leslie said. Something that everyone probably already knows, but to me was a revelation. In Google Docs, in Word, you can choose whether text is heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, just regular text. And I always thought, well, that's dumb. Why would I need that? I just make the font bigger, right? And that takes, that's all I need. It turns out that at least in Google Docs, for example, you can, while you have your main draft, also have sort of an outline sidebar, and it shows you all the headings. And it is, I find it so helpful to be able to go through and have heading 1, heading 2 size things and see the structure developing alongside the draft as I'm writing it, and seeing exactly how many parts are there to the scenario, which parts have I not yet written. To me, that's just really valuable. And I'll go back to a comment we talked about earlier of like using multiple drafts. I'm the kind of person who will outline, and the outline will expand, and it'll just keep expanding until I'm adding periods. And one of the good ways of doing that is just saving new draft, new draft, new draft, because it can create the appearance of progress. And the appearance of progress, that might just be enough to actually get you motivated to make actual progress. It can feel liberating to be like, wow, I really struggled with this draft. But draft X+1, this is going to be different. Now I'm creative again. I'm sort of looking at it with fresh eyes, because it's a new draft. It's just something that you copied a moment ago. But again, that cognitive trickery can really help you make progress.
On that optimistic, hopeful note, we are honor bound to end. It is 6 o'clock. Thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate tremendously the panelists. Your insights are unsurpassed. And to the audience, thank you so much to be here. Please reach out to everyone with questions. And yeah, we hope to see you all successfully writing, and we're happy to be part of that. So good luck, everybody.
And reach out.
Yeah,
right?
please.
If
Yes.
you need help, all the
Yeah.
folks here, in one way or another, love helping out. So please.
It is a community,
take it
and
back.
that's what we're doing. So